I always thought our marriage was built on trust. That belief survived 10 years, a mortgage, and 2 kids, right up until the afternoon I found a single piece of paper in a closet that unraveled all of it in about 4 seconds. My husband, Mark, had named his ex-wife as the primary beneficiary of his life insurance policy. Not me. Her. And when I finally confronted him about it, he told me a story that made it sound almost noble, an old promise from their divorce, 15 years ago, that he'd simply never gotten around to updating. I believed that story for exactly 6 days. Then an attorney pulled the policy's actual amendment history, and I learned the date on that form wasn't 15 years old at all. It was 3. Signed and renewed well into our marriage, during a specific month I remember with total clarity, for reasons that had nothing to do with any promise made during his divorce. This is the story of how one piece of paper in a closet turned into a complete unraveling of what I thought I understood about the last 10 years of my marriage, and the exact moment I learned my husband hadn't forgotten an old obligation. He'd made a brand new one, in secret, and then lied to my face about when. It started on an aggressively ordinary Tuesday, the kind where the biggest expected crisis was what to make for dinner. I was on a decluttering mission, finally tackling the doom box of loose papers that had migrated with us through 2 moves, and I found it tucked on the top shelf of Mark's closet, a thin folder, a leftover from some long-abandoned attempt at organization. Our life, up until that Tuesday, felt entirely ordinary in the best possible sense. Mark worked as a project manager for a regional construction firm, steady, reliable work that had let us build a genuinely comfortable life together, a house in a quiet neighborhood, 2 kids in elementary school, the kind of unremarkable domestic rhythm most people spend their whole lives quietly hoping for. I'd known, in the abstract, distant way you know facts about a partner's past that predate you, that Mark had been married before, briefly, in his late 20s, and that the marriage had ended in a divorce he described, whenever it came up at all, as amicable and thoroughly finished. I had no reason, across 10 years together, to think of his ex-wife as anything more than a distant, settled chapter of a life that existed before ours ever began. Inside, under old tax returns and a car title, was a life insurance policy statement I didn't recognize. I scanned the details automatically at first, policy number, coverage amount, and then my eyes landed on the beneficiary line. It wasn't my name. It was hers. His ex-wife. I remember the specific physical sensation of that moment, the air seeming to leave the room in one motion. My first instinct was the same one anyone's would be: this had to be a mistake, an old policy he'd simply forgotten to update. We'd been married 10 years. He and his ex had been divorced for 15. Surely this was just an oversight, a piece of paperwork lost somewhere in the ordinary chaos of building a life together. I actually let out a small, disbelieving laugh, standing there alone in the closet, the specific kind of reflexive sound that happens when your brain simply refuses, for a moment, to process something as real. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that this was exactly the kind of thing that happens in stories other people tell, not something that actually happens inside your own decade-long marriage, in your own bedroom, on an entirely ordinary Tuesday afternoon. But standing there in the quiet of our bedroom, a colder, more specific dread started pushing past every explanation I tried to construct for myself. An oversight, for 15 years, through an entire marriage, a mortgage, 2 children? That didn't track the way an accident should. It felt, instead, like something I'd stumbled onto by pure chance, a secret that had been sitting quietly in a closet the entire time I believed I understood exactly what our life together actually was. I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, my hands moving with a strange, deliberate precision I didn't fully recognize in myself. I knew, standing there, that I couldn't simply ask him about it. Not yet. If this really was a secret, a direct question wouldn't get me the truth. It would only hand him the opportunity to construct a convenient one. I stood in that closet for what felt like a long time, though it was probably only a few minutes, running through every plausible innocent explanation I could construct. Maybe he'd simply never thought to review old paperwork like this, the way most people don't. Maybe it genuinely was a forgotten leftover, exactly the kind of administrative oversight that happens in busy lives. I wanted, very badly, for one of those explanations to be the actual truth. But some quieter, more honest part of me already understood that wanting an explanation to be true isn't the same thing as it actually being true, and that the only way to know for certain was to look considerably harder before I said anything to him directly. My shock hardened, over the following few hours, into something calmer and considerably colder. The woman who'd been cheerfully decluttering her closet that morning was gone. In her place was someone more careful, more methodical, someone who understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she needed proof before she needed a conversation. That evening unfolded like an ordinary night in our marriage. On the surface, dinner, small talk about our days, the specific domestic choreography of 15 years together. Underneath it, an entirely separate, silent film was playing in my head, replaying years of shared moments now cast in a suspicious new light. I remember watching Mark load the dishwasher after dinner that night, an ordinary, unremarkable task he'd performed 1,000 times across our marriage, and feeling a strange, disorienting dissonance between the mundane domesticity of that moment and the specific, cold question now sitting underneath everything I observed about him. I found myself studying small details I'd never previously had reason to examine: how he answered a text message on his phone, whether he seemed distracted, whether some part of him was, even in that ordinary moment, quietly aware of a secret I hadn't yet confronted him about. I didn't reach any conclusions that night beyond a growing, uncomfortable certainty that I genuinely didn't know this man as completely as I believed I did for the past decade. The actual investigation began once he was asleep. I opened his laptop, a device I hadn't had any real reason to look through in years, telling myself I was simply looking for additional context, more insurance paperwork, anything that might explain the folder as an innocent oversight. What I found instead was a small, recurring transfer buried in years of saved bank statements: $75, moving out on the 15th of every month, memos simply reading, premium, originating from a personal checking account of his I knew existed but had never had reason to examine closely. I checked the dates on that recurring transfer. It stretched back years, a quiet, automated confirmation of a commitment I had absolutely no knowledge of. This wasn't a forgotten policy gathering dust somewhere. It was active. Someone was deliberately, continuously maintaining it. A quick search through his email for the insurance company's name surfaced years of annual policy statements, sent to an email address I didn't even know he had. Each one confirmed the same detail, over and over: beneficiary, her name, primary, unchanged. The knot in my stomach tightened considerably. This had stopped being a single piece of paper. It was a pattern, a conscious, ongoing choice, repeated monthly, for years, entirely without my knowledge. It felt, in the most literal sense I could construct for it, like a financial affair conducted in complete silence, a separate life quietly funded month after month alongside the one I believed we were building together. I remember sitting at his desk that night, the glow of the laptop the only light in the room, doing quiet, careful math in my head. $75 a month, for what the transfer history suggested was at least 6 or 7 years, came to several $1,000s total, not a devastating sum on its own, but a specific, quantifiable measure of consistent, deliberate attention paid to an obligation I hadn't known existed at all. It wasn't the amount that unsettled me most. It was the consistency. Money can slip through a household's cracks in 100 forgettable, careless ways. This wasn't that. This was scheduled, automated, protected from ever being forgotten or interrupted, in a way that took actual, ongoing effort to maintain. My late-night research shifted, over the following days, from personal archaeology into an unexpected crash course in insurance and family law, and what I learned there was considerably more alarming than I'd anticipated. I learned that a divorce decree doesn't automatically override a previously named beneficiary, a detail that genuinely surprised me, given how obvious it seems in hindsight. For many employer-sponsored plans specifically governed by a federal law called ERISA, plan administrators are actually required to pay whoever is named on the most recent beneficiary form, regardless of that person's current relationship to the policyholder. Some state laws do automatically remove an ex-spouse as beneficiary following a divorce. Federal law, in many circumstances, overrides those state protections entirely. I read enough legal terminology over those few nights: ERISA preemption, qualified domestic relations orders, beneficiary designation supremacy, to understand the actual, brutal shape of what I might be facing. This wasn't simply a private emotional betrayal. It was a legally binding financial arrangement that could, depending on the policy's specific terms and how it was actually structured, leave me, his wife of 10 years, with genuinely nothing in the event of his death, regardless of what either of us privately understood our marriage to actually mean. I remember calling the insurance company's general customer service line myself, before I'd retained any attorney, simply to ask, in vague, general terms, how beneficiary designations typically worked following a policyholder's remarriage. The representative I spoke with, reading from what was clearly a standard script, confirmed exactly what my own research had already suggested, that remarriage alone does not automatically change a beneficiary designation, and that the policyholder himself would need to actively submit a change of beneficiary form for any update to take effect. Hanging up that call, I understood with total clarity that whatever had happened with our own policy, it hadn't happened by any kind of automatic default. Someone had to have actively chosen, or actively failed to choose, the situation I'd found. That realization changed the entire shape of what I was dealing with. Mark hadn't simply kept an emotional secret. He'd actively maintained a legal and financial structure that prioritized his ex-wife over me, for reasons I still didn't understand, in a form that had genuine, serious consequences for my own future. My need to eventually confront him stopped being purely about hurt feelings. It became, considerably more urgently, about protecting myself. I spent one particular evening, roughly 4 days into this research, reading through several online forums where other spouses described discovering similar situations, some considerably worse than mine appeared to be at that point. A recurring theme in those accounts struck me as especially relevant to my own situation, one legal blog specifically warning that beneficiary designations are often the single most overlooked detail in an otherwise healthy marriage, precisely because they sit quietly in the background, rarely discussed, rarely reviewed, until a death or a divorce forces the question. I understood, reading that my own situation wasn't some freakishly unusual anomaly. It was, apparently, a genuinely common blind spot, one that had simply never occurred to me to examine in my own marriage until I'd stumbled onto it entirely by accident. That I waited until Saturday morning, wanting the clarity of daylight rather than the charged atmosphere of a late-night confrontation. I made 2 cups of coffee, the same ordinary ritual we'd shared 1,000 mornings before, and slid the folder across our coffee table between us. I watched something shift across his face in real time, confusion first, then recognition, then something considerably closer to panic. I was cleaning out the closet, I told him, keeping my voice level. He opened the folder slowly, hands not quite steady, and offered an explanation with practiced, almost too smooth ease. Oh, this. Wow, this is old. I completely forgot this even existed. I pushed the printed bank statements across the table next to it. Did you? Because you haven't forgotten to pay the $75 premium. Not once. Not in 10 years of marriage. The color left his face entirely. He looked between the statement and me, mouth opening and closing without producing any actual words. The casual, forgetful mask was gone. He'd been caught, cleanly, with no remaining room to maneuver. I want to describe that specific silence, because it told me almost as much as anything he eventually said out loud. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, though it felt considerably longer sitting across from him at that table. I watched him run through, almost visibly, a rapid search for some remaining angle, some way to still frame this as smaller than it actually was. I could see the exact moment he gave up trying to find one. It's not what you think, he finally managed. Then tell me what it is, I said. Help me understand why, for our entire marriage, you've made sure your ex-wife is protected if something happens to you, while I'm not. Help me understand why this needed to be a secret. His composure fully collapsed at that point, replaced by a rapid, defensive explanation. It was part of the divorce settlement, he said. A promise he'd made to her, years earlier, because she'd been left with genuinely nothing after their marriage ended. He framed it, in that moment, as simply the right thing to do, an old debt of decency he'd quietly continued honoring. The right thing to do was lying to your wife for a decade? I asked. Keeping a secret email account? An entire separate financial life I had no idea existed? Did this promise also include never once telling me about it? The argument escalated from there, but the real turning point wasn't the raised voices. It came in the quieter moment afterward, once his anger and defensiveness finally ran out of momentum, leaving only a considerably uglier truth behind it. "There's more, isn't there?" I asked. The question sat in the air between us for a long, heavy moment before he finally nodded, still unable to meet my eyes. The policy, it turned out, wasn't an isolated secret. It was the visible tip of a much larger financial arrangement I had no previous knowledge of at all. The policy itself, he explained, functioned partly as informal security for a personal loan he'd given his ex-wife years earlier, one she was still quietly, unofficially repaying. There had been other things too: help with a car repair, a co-signed loan supporting a small business venture of hers. Individually, each detail might have looked like simple, misplaced generosity. Together, they described a man who had never actually finished closing out his first marriage at all. I asked him, once this fuller picture had emerged, roughly how much money had actually moved toward his ex-wife across the years of our marriage, adding together the loan, the car repair, and whatever portion of the co-signed business loan he'd personally covered when her payments fell short. He gave me a number that afternoon considerably larger than anything I'd been braced for, an amount that, had I known about it incrementally over the years rather than all at once in a single devastating morning, would likely have meaningfully changed decisions we'd made together about our own household's finances, a kitchen renovation we'd postponed twice for budget reasons, a vacation we'd scaled back, small, ordinary sacrifices I'd accepted at the time without ever understanding where a meaningful portion of our supposedly tight budget had actually been quietly going instead. He hadn't married me and built an entirely new life. He'd simply added me onto an existing one where his ex-wife remained a quiet, ongoing financial dependent rather than a genuinely closed chapter of his past. I asked him, directly, why he'd never told me any of this. His answer, delivered barely above a whisper, was the detail that actually broke something in me more than anything else that morning. "I didn't tell you because I knew you wouldn't understand. I didn't want you to think less of me." That was the exact moment the floor gave out beneath our marriage, more than the policy itself ever had. This wasn't really about the money, or even about her specifically. It was about his complete unwillingness to trust me with an uncomfortable truth, his quiet decision, made entirely without my input, that I wasn't someone he owed honesty to. Trust, I understood sitting there, hadn't just been broken. I wasn't certain it had ever genuinely existed at all. I asked him, in the quiet that followed, whether he'd ever imagined a scenario where I found out about all of this some other way, not through my own accidental discovery, but through him actually choosing, at some point, to simply tell me. He was quiet for a long time before admitting that he'd thought about it, more than once, usually late at night, and had always talked himself out of it, telling himself the timing was never right, that I'd only misunderstand what he considered a genuinely well-intentioned commitment. I asked him how many years he'd been telling himself that particular story. He didn't have an answer, or perhaps didn't want to say the number out loud. I want to describe something that nagged at me for several days following that confrontation, a small, specific inconsistency I couldn't initially name, but that eventually became the thread that unraveled everything Mark had told me. He'd framed the beneficiary designation, repeatedly, as a holdover from their divorce 15 years earlier, an old, essentially fossilized promise he'd simply never revisited. But something about that framing kept catching, uncomfortably, against my own memory of our marriage. I remembered, with unusual specificity, a stretch roughly 3 years earlier when Mark had gone through what he described to me at the time as a difficult, reflective period, increased contact with old friends, a noticeable withdrawal from our own daily life for several weeks, behavior I'd attributed, at the time, to ordinary midlife stress rather than anything more significant. I found myself wondering, with a growing unease, whether that specific period actually connected to the policy somehow, rather than the arrangement being the ancient, static holdover Mark had described. I didn't have any way to verify that suspicion on my own. Insurance companies, I quickly learned, don't simply hand over a policy's amendment history to a beneficiary's spouse on request, particularly when that spouse isn't the policyholder themselves. I made a decision, at that point, that I hadn't seriously considered until that specific nagging inconsistency took hold. I needed a professional who could actually access and verify the policy's real history, rather than continuing to rely entirely on Mark's own account of it. I spent an evening, before making that call, trying to talk myself out of it, running through the same tired justifications I'd already used once to avoid confronting him too quickly. Maybe I was overthinking a vague, half-remembered impression of a difficult few weeks 3 years ago. Maybe my own memory of that period wasn't as reliable as I believed it to be. But the more I tried to talk myself into simply accepting his account, the more clearly I recognized that same instinct in myself that had let this entire situation go unnoticed for years in the first place, a preference for a comfortable, uncomplicated explanation over the more difficult work of actually verifying whether that explanation was true. I want to describe one conversation from this period that I haven't yet mentioned, because it mattered enormously to how I approached everything that followed. I called my sister the same evening I first noticed the timeline inconsistency, describing the nagging feeling that Mark's account of an old, forgotten promise didn't line up cleanly with my own memory of our marriage. My sister, who has a background in accounting and has always had a sharper eye for financial detail than I do, asked me a single question that reframed how I approached everything from that point forward. She asked whether I had any actual documentation confirming when the beneficiary designation had originally been set, or whether I was simply taking Mark's word for the timeline entirely. I realized, sitting with that question, that I had done exactly that, accepted his account of 15 years ago, without a single piece of independent verification, the same unquestioning trust that had apparently let this entire arrangement go unnoticed for years in the first place. That conversation is what ultimately pushed me toward retaining an attorney rather than simply accepting Mark's explanation and trying to move forward from there. My sister's specific, practical skepticism gave me permission to stop taking his account at face value, something I don't think I would have arrived at on my own quite as quickly that I retained an attorney, a careful, direct woman named Denise, who specialized in marital and estate financial disputes, a specialty I hadn't previously had reason to know existed but that turned out to be exactly what my situation required. Denise explained that while I couldn't unilaterally compel the insurance company to disclose full account details to me directly, given that I wasn't the named policyholder, she could formally request the policy's complete amendment and beneficiary designation history as part of a broader marital financial disclosure process, framed around my legitimate interest in understanding assets and obligations within our marriage. That request, submitted through proper legal channels, took roughly 3 weeks to produce a response. Denise was candid with me, during our very first consultation, that cases involving this kind of financial discovery within an intact marriage occupy a somewhat unusual legal space. I wasn't yet pursuing a divorce, which would have given me broader, more straightforward discovery rights, but I also had a legitimate, ongoing interest in understanding my own marital financial exposure, particularly given the co-signed obligations I'd already begun to suspect existed beyond the policy itself. She structured her initial request carefully, framing it around my right to understand jointly held marital assets and liabilities, rather than as an adversarial discovery process aimed specifically at building a case against Mark, a distinction she said mattered both legally and, frankly, for keeping the door open to resolving this within our marriage rather than immediately escalating toward divorce proceedings. What came back reframed everything Mark had told me on that Saturday morning. The insurance company's records showed the current beneficiary designation had not, in fact, originated 15 years earlier at the time of his divorce. It had been formally re-signed and renewed just over 3 years prior, squarely within the exact period I'd already begun to suspect, the very same stretch of unexplained distance and distraction I'd once attributed to ordinary midlife stress. I sat with Denise's office on speakerphone, staring at that date, feeling something shift permanently in how I understood the entire situation. Mark hadn't simply failed to update an old, forgotten promise across 15 years of marriage. He had made an active, deliberate decision, 3 years into our life together, to renew and reaffirm his ex-wife's position as primary beneficiary, and had then, when confronted, specifically and repeatedly described that decision as ancient history in order to make it sound considerably less troubling than what it actually was. Denise explained, once we'd both absorbed the actual date, why this specific detail mattered so much more than I'd initially registered in the moment. A 15-year-old, never updated designation, however uncomfortable, at least fits a recognizable, almost sympathetic category, a person who simply never got around to a piece of paperwork most people rarely think about at all. A designation actively renewed 3 years into a subsequent marriage is a different category of act entirely. It requires a deliberate decision, a physical signature, an active choice made at a specific, identifiable moment, by someone who was, at that exact time, also fully, currently married to me. There was no version of that timeline that could be softened into an oversight. Denise's office also helped me request whatever underlying documentation existed explaining the renewal itself, since insurance policies of this kind typically require some administrative trigger, a policy renewal cycle, a life event, a formal request from the policyholder, rather than renewing themselves automatically without any prompting. What we found was a formal change of beneficiary request form, submitted by Mark directly, dated to that same 3-year-old window, coinciding almost exactly with a period his ex-wife had gone through her own difficult divorce from her second husband. Denise pointed out something else in that same document that I'd initially overlooked in my rush to focus on the date itself. The form included a brief, handwritten note in the margin, in what was unmistakably Mark's handwriting, reading simply, "Per our conversation, effective immediately." That phrase, small as it was, confirmed something Denise said mattered enormously to how we should understand the entire situation. This hadn't been a passive renewal, some automatic administrative continuation of an old arrangement. It had followed an actual, direct conversation between Mark and his ex-wife, one deliberate enough that he'd felt the need to reference it in writing on the form itself. I confronted him with this specific timeline once Denise's office had confirmed it, and this time, he didn't attempt to minimize or reframe anything. He told me, quietly, that his ex-wife had reached out to him during that period, in genuine crisis, and that he had made the decision, entirely on his own, to formally reaffirm and strengthen his financial commitment to her at exactly that moment, while our own marriage, our own 2 children, our own shared financial life, continued entirely unaware that decision had ever been made. I asked him the question that had been building in me since Denise's report first arrived. I asked whether he understood the specific difference between what he'd actually done and what he'd originally told me, that this wasn't an old debt he'd simply never revisited, but a fresh, deliberate choice made well into our marriage, at a moment I remembered distinctly as a period when I'd sensed him pulling away from me without ever understanding why. He didn't have a real answer for that distinction. I don't think, even now, he's fully willing to sit with what it actually reveals about the choices he made, and the ones he didn't. I also asked him something else that had been sitting with me since I first noticed the timeline inconsistency days earlier, whether he remembered that same period the way I did, the weeks where he'd seemed distant, distracted, present in body but somewhere else entirely in every conversation we had. He said he did remember it, and that he'd told himself, at the time, that his distraction was simply stress from work, a story I now understood he'd been telling both of us simultaneously, 2 separate convenient explanations for the exact same underlying reality. I asked him how it felt, hearing me describe a period of our marriage he'd quietly spent renewing a financial commitment to someone else. He said it felt like finally being asked to look directly at something he'd spent 3 years successfully avoiding looking at himself. Once Denise and I understood the complete, verified timeline, we moved from investigation into active protection of my own financial position, a process that unfolded across several parallel tracks. Denise helped me formally request, through our marriage's own financial disclosure obligations, a complete accounting of every financial connection Mark maintained with his ex-wife, the original loan, the car repair assistance, the co-signed business loan, establishing, with actual documentation rather than his own selective account, the genuine scope of an arrangement he had kept hidden from me for years. That accounting revealed the total financial exposure was considerably larger than the picture he'd initially, reluctantly admitted to on that Saturday morning, including a co-signed obligation that could have left me exposed to collection efforts had his business venture failed while we remained legally married. Denise walked me through exactly why that co-signed obligation mattered so much more than I'd initially understood sitting across from Mark that first Saturday. Because we were legally married throughout the entire period he'd co-signed his ex-wife's business loan, and because our state's marital property laws treated at least some of our shared assets as jointly held regardless of whose name appeared on any specific account, a default on that loan could, in a worst-case scenario, have exposed jointly held marital assets to collection, entirely without my knowledge or consent, for a debt I had never agreed to and had no idea existed until this entire investigation began. Denise described this specific exposure as one of the more serious practical risks buried inside what had initially looked, on the surface, like a purely emotional betrayal. Denise also helped me understand my own options regarding the life insurance policy itself. Because Mark and I were still legally married throughout this entire process, I had standing to formally request, through our own attorneys, that he either designate me as a co-beneficiary reflecting our marriage's actual financial partnership, or that he separate his financial obligations to his ex-wife into a clearly defined, independently documented arrangement that didn't leave my own future financial security dependent on an undisclosed, unilateral decision he'd made without my knowledge. She presented these as options rather than demands, explaining that her role at this stage was to give me a clear, complete picture of what was actually possible, so I could decide for myself how I wanted to proceed, rather than being steered toward any particular outcome by her own judgment. I appreciated that approach considerably, given how much of the preceding weeks had already involved other people, Mark, primarily, making significant decisions that affected my life without ever actually consulting me. Denise's insistence on giving me real, informed choices rather than a predetermined path felt like its own small, necessary corrective to everything that had happened up to that point. Mark ultimately agreed, after considerable additional difficult conversation, to restructure the policy, establishing a separate, smaller policy specifically covering his existing loan obligation to his ex-wife, clearly documented and capped at the loan's actual remaining balance, while designating me as primary beneficiary on his larger, employer-provided policy going forward. It wasn't the resolution I'd have chosen if none of this had ever happened at all. It was, at least, an honest, transparent arrangement rather than a silent, 3-year-old secret I'd stumbled onto entirely by accident. The negotiation process itself took nearly 2 months to fully finalize, considerably longer than I'd initially expected, largely because untangling the actual loan balance from his ex-wife required her own cooperation in providing documentation of what she'd already repaid versus what remained outstanding, a conversation Mark had to have with her directly, one he described to me afterward as almost as difficult as the ones we'd been having with each other. I don't know, and honestly don't want to know, the specific details of that conversation. What mattered to me was the outcome, a documented, verified, capped obligation, clearly separated from my own financial future, rather than an open-ended, silently renewing commitment I'd have no way of monitoring or verifying going forward that I want to describe, briefly, the specific challenge of navigating this entire ordeal while continuing to parent our 2 children, both young enough that we made a deliberate decision not to explain the actual details of what was happening, but old enough to notice that something in our household had fundamentally shifted. Our older child, 9 at the time, asked me directly, more than once during those first difficult weeks, why Mark and I seemed different with each other, quieter, more careful. I told her, in language appropriate for her age, that Mommy and Daddy were working through a hard disagreement, the kind grown-ups sometimes have, and that we were getting help from people whose job was to help families through exactly this kind of thing. I don't know how satisfying that explanation actually was to a 9-year-old's specific curiosity, but it was honest, as far as it went, without burdening her with details she had no need to carry at her age. Maintaining a stable, calm household for our children throughout this process became, in its own way, one of the more grounding tasks I had during a period when almost everything else in my life felt uncertain. Their ordinary needs, homework, dinner, bedtime routines, gave me something concrete and manageable to focus on during weeks when the larger questions about my marriage felt entirely unmanageable. That I want to be honest about where things actually stand now, rather than offering a cleaner resolution than what's genuinely true. Mark and I are in counseling, working through what remains an enormous, still largely unresolved breach of trust. Some sessions, I see real, genuine effort from him, an honest reckoning with why he made the choice he did 3 years ago, why he felt safer lying about the timeline than simply telling me the truth at the time. Other sessions, I still find myself sitting across from someone who feels, in important ways, like a stranger I've been sharing a house with for a decade. Our counselor, a careful, experienced therapist who specializes specifically in trust ruptures following financial infidelity, a category of counseling I hadn't known existed until this entire ordeal made it suddenly, urgently relevant to my own life, has been clear with both of us that rebuilding trust after a discovery like this typically takes considerably longer than either partner initially expects. Often 18 months to 2 years of consistent, demonstrated honesty before genuine trust can meaningfully return, if it returns at all. I found that timeline both discouraging and, in its own way, clarifying, permission to stop expecting a quick emotional resolution, and to instead measure progress in small, incremental, sometimes barely perceptible steps. That I opened my own bank account, entirely separate from our joint finances, within the first week of this entire ordeal, and I've maintained it since, along with my own complete set of financial records and an independent relationship with a financial advisor who reports only to me. I don't know, honestly, whether our marriage survives this. What I do know is that my own financial security no longer depends entirely on someone else's unverified honesty, the way it did for the first 10 years of our marriage without my ever fully realizing it. I've also had to sit with a specific, ongoing question I don't think will ever fully resolve for me, one I find myself returning to during quiet moments, whether the man I've been married to for 10 years is someone who made one significant, if deeply flawed, decision under a specific kind of guilt and pressure, or whether this reveals something more fundamental about his capacity for honesty that extends well beyond this one situation. Our counselor has been careful not to push me toward either conclusion prematurely, encouraging me instead to let the answer emerge gradually, through his actual behavior over time, rather than deciding it in advance based on my own understandable fear and anger. I find that guidance genuinely difficult to follow some days, and genuinely wise on others. That I don't tell this story to suggest every spouse with an old life insurance policy is hiding something sinister. Most beneficiary oversights genuinely are just that, oversights, forgotten paperwork from an earlier chapter of someone's life. What happened in my marriage was something considerably more deliberate, an active, ongoing financial commitment, renewed at a specific, identifiable moment well into our marriage, then deliberately mischaracterized as ancient history the instant I found out about it. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, it's simple, and it costs almost nothing to actually do. Request a copy of your own spouse's life insurance beneficiary designation periodically, directly from the insurer if your marriage allows for that kind of joint financial transparency, rather than simply trusting that whatever you were told years ago still accurately reflects the current, actual paperwork. A 5-minute request could have told me, years earlier, exactly what took me a folder in a closet and an attorney's formal investigation to eventually uncover. I am not the same woman who stumbled onto that piece of paper on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That woman believed trust was simply a given, something you didn't need to verify once it had been established. This woman understands that trust, in a marriage, has to be periodically confirmed, not just quietly assumed indefinitely. I have my own accounts now. My own advisor. My own complete understanding of exactly where I actually stand, regardless of what Mark does or doesn't eventually choose to tell me about anything else. I think, often, about how differently this entire story might have unfolded if I'd simply accepted Mark's first explanation on that Saturday morning, if I'd never noticed the specific inconsistency in his timeline, if I'd never made that call to my sister who pushed me to actually verify rather than simply trust. I don't think I would have been foolish to accept his account at face value. Most people, reasonably, extend exactly that kind of trust to a spouse of 10 years without demanding independent verification of every claim. What I've learned, though, is that the specific instinct to verify, once something genuinely feels inconsistent, is worth honoring rather than dismissing as paranoia, even when doing so feels uncomfortable, even when it risks uncovering something you'd rather not know. If this story affected you, or if you've ever uncovered a financial secret that forced you to see years of your own life completely differently, I want to hear about it in the comments. Specifically, I'm curious whether you found out by accident the way I did, or whether you went looking because something already felt wrong. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned about protecting my own future, every day.